Welcome to the latest edition of our Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions, The Wave of the Future podcast series. I'm Helen Clegg, and I'm joined today by Natascha Schijven and Vijay. Natascha is a Vice President with Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions and is based in New York. Natascha has been with the firm for over 7 years and brings with her a solid background in international strategic sourcing, procurement, and innovative sourcing techniques. Vijay is a senior manager with Kearney and has been with the firm for over 4 years. Vijay is based in our Atlanta office. His experience spans multiple industries and specialities, including supply chain management, strategic sourcing and procurement, and advanced sourcing techniques. The topic of today's podcast is about an innovative approach to sourcing direct materials categories. Natascha and Vijay, welcome to the podcast. I want to start by providing our listeners with some context to this topic. Natascha, what is best practice when sourcing direct materials, and what's driving the need for innovative solutions?
Thanks, Helen. So, from our perspective, best practice when sourcing direct materials really relates to stop doing what we used to do and start using more innovative levers that have a better fit with today's situation. You can no longer really use negotiations or traditional flat sheet RFP to maximize your sourcing savings. It is an antiquated approach, right? The dynamics of the world that changes all the time. So we need to make sure that we move with that and we come up with innovative approaches to really extract the maximum value from a sourcing perspective. Now, some of the key trends that we've been seeing is the need for far more transparency. Especially in the direct materials space, you can see a lot of consolidation going on in the packaging, food, chemicals industries. We need to instill transparency to be able to get the same results. It is no longer just simply negotiating or doing a simple RFP. Another element is collaboration. So instead of trying to push on suppliers' margins, we need to look at where we can collaboratively take cost out. And we need to hear them. We need to really actively listen to our supply base and say, hey, what are some innovations that you have that could really help take cost out of our joint supply chain? So that's where some of these levers that we are calling the most innovative levers for direct materials management kind of come from. A couple are, for instance, the direct buy programs that we do. There's two-step leveraging where we take the strategic sourcing process and kind of flip the steps around. And then, for instance, there's also several levers that focus on specification and process improvement. And the fourth one that I'd like to mention is really the one that we are pretty proud of, which is the request for solution, which has really been able to give us double-digit savings in very difficult categories over the past 5 to 6 years or so. And those levers really came from looking at the current situation that we're in, realizing that old tools no longer do, and really the need to make sure that we adapt to that, do things differently to extract maximum value out of sourcing today.
So, Natascha, about the request for solution, or RFS as you call it, can you define this for us? How does it work, and why do you call it a request for solution?
Yes, so let me start off with the last question. We call it a request for solution because it looks beyond price, it looks beyond cost. It really looks at suppliers to give us the best business solution. What that means is that we don't, like I just mentioned, we don't just send out a quick flat sheet and say, these are our constraints, this is what you need to fit your quote into. We give them a more flexible solution, which is called the request for solution, in which they can give us different alternatives, in which they can completely come up with different bundles, market baskets, in which they can give us absolutely free text, completely free and flexible ideas. We combine all of that and we extract what the best value is. So that's why it's called a request for solution. It's not just looking at price, it looks at the total cost of ownership, the total value, and really seeing how our clients business best links into and is the best strategic fit with a supplier's business.
Vijay, the request for solution employs a variety of tools. What tools make up the RFS, and can you tell us a little bit about each one?
Absolutely. Before I go into the tools, I want to just highlight what Natascha said. In today's sourcing needs, I guess the strategic needs, the three key planks are transparency, collaboration, and innovation, as Natascha said. So the RFS comprises of tools that essentially helps address these three elements. And just to elaborate a little more on each of these, the first key tool that's almost like a backbone or foundation of this RFS is a cost model. And when we talk about this cost model, this is a cost model that we collaborate with the suppliers to build a very detailed cost model that reflects suppliers' actual costs. And in terms of cost elements, it would include all of the cost elements that suppliers incur from actual raw material cost inputs, the process cost inputs, the whole handling, storage, warehousing, and delivery cost inputs, along with, of course, the SG&A and other overhead cost inputs. I mean, this is essentially the backbone of RFS, and it is extremely detailed, sometimes going up to 80 to 100 different cost inputs that we would capture working with a supplier. The cost modeling is of course the backbone, and this captures almost like an as-is situation. The other tool, what we capture as alternative bidding, is where we get the costs, while the parametric bidding or the cost modeling is where we get supplier inputs for existing constraints and existing specifications. Alternative bidding is focused on alternatives to the existing situation that we define in a controlled manner. For example, a couple of alternatives that we could request from suppliers are things like order size. So we can always say, suppliers, this is the current order size that we have. What's the price for it? That is something that's captured in our cost modeling already. But in terms of alternative, we can have the suppliers alter this order size and tell us if the order size is this, maybe 2x of the current order size, there could be an additional cost benefit of x or so on. This tool is what we call as alternative bidding. While I elaborated on order size, we could solicit different alternatives from alternative specifications, from alternative, the print technologies, or so on. The third element is about bundling and discounts. This is where we not only ask suppliers to provide certain alternatives, we kind of tap into suppliers' strengths and tell us how they can best provide the cost if they were awarded a group of SKUs, and help them define this group of SKUs. Many a times, when you talk about large companies and direct materials, they have hundreds, if not thousands of SKUs. And there are some similarities and differences between these SKUs. And this is where suppliers can create these bundles and pretty much let the client know that if they were awarded this bundle, they would gain some of the synergy benefits that they would like to pass on. So this is the third tool, which is a little less controlled fashion, where supplier tells the client how best they can give discount if they were awarded a group of SKUs. The fourth element that we call as free text generation, right? Free text idea generation. This is a full free flow tool where we let suppliers and the client, of course, how they can improve the current situation by tapping on the latest process improvements that they've done or the latest technology that they've implemented. This is where they can share their expertise and path-breaking ideas. And many a times, this is fantastic information for the client because, the client doesn't know what advances in technology that happens in the suppliers world, and this would enable clients to generate this future cost savings or cost improvement opportunities by tapping on suppliers process and technology strengths that they've developed in the past.
Vijay, where does the collaborative optimization fit into the request for solution and how does it work?
Well, collaborative optimization, as the name itself suggests, is all about how we can collaborate with the suppliers to maximize the benefits for both parties in a way, which in fact means how can we award the business which taps into each of the supplier's strengths at a high level. How it works in this RFS context is that when we are using this cost model as part of this RFS approach, as you can imagine, there are multiple input costs that we capture through this RFS from the suppliers. For example, a typical a direct material, maybe like a packaging category like flexible films, may have about 30 to 40 supplier cost inputs. This may include inputs like the cost of each of the resins, cost of ink, cost of lamination, the laminate, the extrudate, and so on, right? So these 30 to 40 cost elements is applicable for every single SKU, and a large CPG, if you take any films kind of category, they may have anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 SKUs. And when in fact, if you combine all of these cost elements and the number of SKUs, it could very well runs into hundreds of thousands of permutations that we have to run based on all the inputs we've received. Not to mention the alternative bids that we'll receive for some of the alternates that we define would just exponentially multiply the number of combinations that we could potentially evaluate. This collaborative optimization technique is where we suck in all of these data elements and be able to run this collaborative scenarios based on business constraints that we can define along with the client. So we have the set of business constraints that we have well defined and this humongous pool of data and variables that we could optimize on. So this is where the traditional Excel solvers or Excel spreadsheets fall short, and we use collaborative optimization tools. There are quite a few in the market, such as Trade Extensions or AIMS or CombineNet for that matter. So we kind of use this technology to achieve this allocate appropriate business scenarios that taps into supplier strengths that serves the client needs.
Natascha, what are the benefits of using a request for solution?
So the key benefits of the request for solution really relate to some of the strategic planks that Vijay mentioned, which are mainly transparency and collaboration. So what we see is that the request for solution helps provide a very granular transparency. And what that allows us to do, what the parametric modeling, which creates that transparency, allows us to do, is really negotiate on a parameter level, which is unprecedented, right? We didn't do that before, where we used to have a negotiation toolkit, which had a couple of elements in it, price, payment terms, maybe delivery terms. Now we have all these different cost elements, which we can use to negotiate on. You have to imagine that across 30, 40 suppliers, we have all these cost inputs, so 80 inputs, and we can compare them and line them up one next to the other and say, hey, supplier, why is your specific cost of starch, for instance, which goes into creating the glue for this particular packaging type, why is that cost 2 standard deviations away from the mean? Right, so that is the level, the granular level that we can negotiate on, and that creates a lot of transparency and a lot of kind of pushes the air out of the value chain, if you will. It prevents the supplier from unwarranted differentiation, I would almost say. So another benefit really is the collaborative aspect. So what the RFS allows us to do is tap into what the supply base feels is really the latest and greatest. right? So we're no longer imposing our thoughts upon them. We're really asking them and actively listening, saying, hey, suppliers, you are the experts in your industry. Why don't you tell us which alternatives we should use, how we should behave, what should we do differently to really fit best with you strategically, right? So that also gives very good ideas for the client to change their buying behavior. For instance, the example that Vijay gave, right? In terms of order quantity, the supplier could say, hey, if you double that order quantity and order every 2 months instead of every 1 month, I can give you an additional 5%. So it is really the collaboration and the transparency aspect that provide benefits just because we're tapping into the latest and greatest out there, which in this day and age is just required with an ever consolidating supply base.
Thanks, Natascha. Vijay, can you share with us a couple of examples where we've used this request for solution for clients, and what was the outcome of using this particular approach?
Well, first of all, as Natascha described, this is a solution we've been using for about, I should say, 5 to 6 years, and we have successfully been able to use this RFS approach for a number of direct materials categories, multiple number of times, at least 10 to 20, if not more, in the last 5 to 6 years. And every single instance that at least that I can remember, we've achieved double-digit savings, as the title suggests. Just to focus on a couple of examples, that I was personally involved. One of the examples that I want to cite is on packaging, sourcing flexible films. So in terms of context, here was a mature client, or I would say it's a mature sourcing organization, and the scope of the project was more North America focused. And we used this innovative approach for a spend of over $100 million, which is, of course, sizable spend, especially when you consider it's all focused in one region. There were about 30 suppliers that we included or we were evaluating through this process. And overall objective, which was very clear direction from the client also, that we are not only achieving short-term objectives on savings, but we also want to pave a long-term path to be best in class for this particular category. So we went ahead and leveraged the RFS approach, worked with the supplier to build a very solid cost model that had probably like 40 to 50 supplier input elements that focused on supplier inputs such as every single resin cost, cost of ink, cost of laminate, and all of the processing elements such as the cost of extrusion, cost of printing, setup costs like printing plates, cleaning the plates, and the whole warehousing and also the handling cost, in addition to SG&A. We were able to work with the suppliers, and by sharing the overall objective of this project, we were able to get suppliers give us those costs, which in turn, helped us to not only get the best outcome for the client through negotiations with each of the suppliers, but also enable suppliers to put their best foot forward to maximize how they can reduce costs from their end or achieve synergies by letting the client know the item groups that they would want to win. So in combination of the supplier inputs, business constraints, and supplier preferences, I should say, we were overall able to achieve about 16 to 20% cost savings on this particular category. The second example I want to cite would be more on ingredients. And when we use this RFS approach for this, global food and beverage client, we had spent in scope globally, for all of their global operations for a number of ingredient categories from citric acid to ascorbic acid, ACE, sorbitol, a whole bunch of other ingredients that we use this on. And we use a very similar approach in mapping the process, understanding the supplier inputs and the cost elements, like, the cost of starch, whether you use the cassava root or the potato or any other, starch-based, cost of producing dextrose in some of these cases, cost of fermentation, and also the whole handling, transportations, and so on. And we used this very successfully for this global client and did achieve double-digit savings as well.
As we come to the end of this podcast, one final question to you, Natascha. Can this sourcing approach be used for sourcing any type of direct material?
I would say it depends, Helen. So it can be sourced really for direct materials that meet a couple of criteria. The key criterion really is complexity, right? That's why we use this approach to really analyze across the complexity. So if there is a direct material category that has sufficient amount of complexity, so it can be complexity in terms of SKUs, it can be complexity in terms of specifications, but it can also be complexity in terms of the amount of constraints that the client has imposed, whether they are rightfully in place or whether they are wrongfully in place. If the category has become complex or is inherently complex because of those reasons, then the request for solution is a very good approach to use. The second element really is spend, because it does take a bit longer to really implement this approach. What we see is you generally need spends of like 25 million or over to be able to get a solid return on consulting investment. So a decent spend in the category is additionally important. If those two criteria are really in place, I would say any direct material is susceptible to this approach. Additionally, what is also helpful, but not necessarily always required, is to have a category which is mechanical in nature. I think that's the best way to put it. So what I mean by that is if you have certain service categories, like if we pick on indirect for a minute, it's very hard to quantify and to put services into different cost buckets. So that's why it's less susceptible or less applicable for some indirect categories. For direct materials, though, you can very easily say these are the raw material costs, these are the processing costs, these are the handling costs, and you can really break those out in like a variety in hundreds of parameters, right? So that's why it's generally more applicable for direct materials. But then again, there are some indirect categories, and we're starting to embark on that, like for instance, MRO, temp labor, that can actually be susceptible with some minor tweaks to the request for solution.
Natascha and Vijay, that was an extremely interesting insight into the request for solution and how it can be used to take out cost. I'd like to finish by sharing my 3 key takeaways from this conversation. First, it's an approach that can be used across a number of direct materials categories that meet certain criteria. Second, it's an effective and efficient way of processing hundreds of thousands of data permutations. And third, it's a great way of transparently collaborating with suppliers to tap into their strengths. On that note, I'd like to thank Natascha Schijven and Vijay Kazi for being my guests today. I'd also like to thank our production engineer, Tom Klein. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. If you have any comments on this podcast or have a suggestion for a podcast topic, please share your thoughts via Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @ATKPAS. This has been an AT Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again soon for our next Wave of the Future podcast.